This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider. Britain's economy watchdog, the Office for Budget Repsonsibility, has released its report into the costs of the coronavirus pandemic, and the UK's finances have cratered. Every bit of growth since 2002 has been wiped out. Up to 4 million jobs across the country could be lost. So how do we get out of this? The Economist Stephen King is with me. And Stephen, the government was hoping for a kind of V-shaped recovery. What happened to that?
Well, the good news is that there was a slight increase in GDP in May, so there was an increase in national income, so to speak. The bad news is that the increase was tiny compared with the drop in April. So the gain of 1.8% in May, I mean, in normal circumstances, you might say that's absolutely fine. But after a 20.3% drop in April, it still means that we're basically bumping along the bottom of the collapse that's been inspired by COVID-19. Now, to be fair, obviously a lot of the lockdown ended not in May, but rather in June, or indeed in early July. So if you look at the pattern that we've seen in continental European countries, where the bounce backs have generally come after the lockdown itself has ended, you might say, well, it's no surprise that May itself has been weak. We'll have to wait until June or July to see the full evidence coming through of the rebound that ideally the government and the Bank of England would like to see. But I think also it's worth stressing that it's not just the lockdown that is contributing to this weakness. It's also the fact that consumers are no longer as confident as they were. They're not quite so keen to go out to restaurants and bars and so on as they might have been in the past. They're not quite so keen to get on an aeroplane and go on holiday. There's a whole bunch of things which are kind of linked to COVID-19 but not directly linked to lockdown. And that, of course, means there's a pretty serious headwind in front of us, irrespective of what the government announces in terms of where you can go shopping.
Is it encouraging that there was growth at all? Does it show that those areas like construction, which came out of lockdown a little bit earlier, have been able to contribute something? And then maybe, and I might be being optimistic here, Stephen, but maybe as other things come out of lockdown, as people start returning to city centres, we might see a sharper recovery.
Oh, I think we'll certainly see a sharper recovery than we've seen so far. Again, it comes back to this idea that the recovery can't really get going until lockdown ends. And of course, that takes you to late June and early July. So I think it's, in one sense, not particularly reasonable to think you're going to have a big rebound very, very early on. But having said that, economists' forecasts, for what they're worth, and they're often not worth a great deal, but the economists' consensus for what was going to happen in May was a rise in GDP of more like 5.5%. So what we actually saw was significantly weaker than expected, and those expectations themselves were frankly pretty depressed. So there's no doubt that the economy itself is in a pretty miserable situation. Having said that, the big test really is not so much what happens through the second quarter, but rather what begins to take place in the third quarter and beyond. Obviously, as the lockdowns end, you'd expect to see better news coming through. The good news, in theory, should be that as lockdowns end, the third quarter really ought to be better than the second quarter. And you look on the high street and restaurants and so on to realise that finally people are coming out of their homes and beginning to go back to a social routine that you might associate with a pre-COVID world. But of course, the huge uncertainty now is what happens with the epidemiology and whether we get, if you like, a second wave of infection as lockdowns end. And the problem here, of course, is that we're seeing exactly that in other parts of the world, whether it's, say, Israel, which locked down very, very early, seemed to have the virus under control, but things have rebounded very badly over the course of the last few weeks, or whether, most obviously, it's some of those US states, because although New York has made significant progress, other parts of the US, of course, have seen almost an exponential increase in infections over the last few weeks. So the truth of the matter is that whatever economists say, there is as yet no cure for the virus, and the virus is still able to spread as and when lockdown.
And is there added uncertainty from a word that I haven't said for quite a while now, but Brexit, Stephen? The possibility of a hard Brexit with a no deal this Christmas, costs of new customs rules with the EU. Could that affect things as well?
Yes. I mean, it's amazing how Brexit disappeared off the the sort of news wires and the headlines almost entirely in the first half of the year. And of course, behind the scenes, negotiations have carried on. And, I suspect if the government is thinking in the kind of almost a Machiavellian way, it might take the view that COVID-19 is so ghastly in terms of its economic impact that whatever additional impact comes from Brexit, it'll be sort of camouflaged, eclipsed almost by the impact of COVID-19. So we'll never know what the impact in addition was from Brexit compared with everything else. Now, of course, it may be that Brexit means that the UK struggles to recover as quickly as perhaps some of the continental European countries might recover if there is this uncertainty at the border that suddenly reappears. But overall, I think that the scale of the loss with COVID-19 is so great that in that sense, Brexit appears to be a relatively small blip.
Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.